I'm talking about the world Christopher Columbus did not discover. But I'm talking about what Christopher Columbus set in motion, because he set in motion, in his period set in motion, an act of criminality that influences our very life today. It laid the basis for Western racism. It laid the basis for misconceptions about people. It laid the basis for extensive use of organized religion as a rationale for the enslavement of people. It's a reoccurring event in history, and it told us, as if nothing has told us before, that history is never old. Everything that ever happens continues to happen. What we are dealing with now is more than the second rise of Europe. We're dealing with the rise of a concept that has taken hold of the mind of most of the world, and people throughout the world are now fighting to get away from that concept, and a whole lot of people are prisoners to that concept. We're dealing with the reason certain things looked as though they were going to succeed and did not succeed. We're actually dealing with the reason why the African independence explosion did not culminate in independence, while the civil rights movement did not culminate in any civil rights, and while the Caribbean Federation did not culminate in any independence from Caribbean states. Independence in name only, flag independence, but actual economic independence, they are more dependent now than they were at the height of colonialism. It set in motion the exposure of the fact that once you are oppressed and once certain information is kept from you, you begin to experience some confusion about what independence consists of. Now, let's look at the world before Columbus. Then let's pick up Columbus's world and look at his impact on the Americas, and look at the world he did not discover. But what he actually did, and he should be credited for this, he set in motion the exploitation of two continents for European domination. He never set foot on North America or South America. He set in motion an attitude that is still with us, a concept called divine white right, and something else called manifest destiny. The assumption, because Europeans had the ships and the basic technology, they had the right to go into other people's country, exploit their mineral resources, to take and rape their women at will. And they did all of this in the name of a God that they said was merciful and kind. All of them using Western Orient religions, and that includes the Arabs, made their God ungodly.
The Voyages of Columbus, mark a starting point of world capitalism and the beginning of European colonial domination of the world. This is what the ruling powers want everyone to celebrate. But it hasn't gone down like that. The oppressed people have a different view. Throughout the past year, there have been debates and confrontations whenever the ruling powers have tried to celebrate Columbus in their system in Spain, the United States, and throughout the Western Hemisphere. In the Dominican Republic, recently, the media reported that soldiers shot into a crowd of anti-Columbus demonstrators and deleted at least 2 people. In Peru, the growing Maoist People's War reveals an important truth. The world system that emerged since Columbus is under assault. Its days are numbered. The proletariat and oppressed peoples have nothing to celebrate on October 12th. The Columbus anniversary is a celebration of mass deletion, slavery, and conquest. More, it exists the continuing oppression of billions of people today. Columbus is something only oppressors or fools could celebrate. This article was first published in the Revolutionary Worker a year ago. It sketches the true history of this so-called first encounter. It is said that the Columbus voyage was the first encounter between the New World and the Old World. This is contrary to all knowledge, to all known information. Travelers from the great African empire of Mali in the 1300s reported that the king of Mali told them of 2 expeditions with hundreds of boats sent from Africa west into the great ocean. Some evidence suggests that there may have been periods of ancient trade to Brazil. There is physical evidence of a settlement in dating back to the year 1000. And by the time Columbus himself, it had become routine for English fishermen to travel across the Atlantic to fish the outer banks, where they often caught sight of the mainland to the west. Altogether, the historical record suggests as many as 20 contacts and sightings before Columbus, right? Why then is the Columbus voyage considered first? Because for the modern ruling classes, the important point is not the actual contact between peoples. It is the world historic growth of capitalism in Europe made possible by the plunder of the Americas. And that did not start before Columbus, right? The above quotes are selected to illustrate the fact that Christopher Columbus discovered absolutely nothing, that he was an adventurer, an optimist, and a willful murderer, and a liar, and that what he set in motion was the basis of Western capitalism and exploitation of both Africans and indigenous Americans who had committed no crimes against European people and did not know of European intention to conquer and enslave them. Both the Africans and the indigenous Americans befriended the Europeans at first, only to be rewarded by enslavement. They did not protect themselves from the Europeans because they did not believe there was a need to. The literature exposing Christopher Columbus and the protracted crimes he set in motion is massive and still growing. Today, former Columbus cheerleaders have discovered the world, have discarded the word discovery and are now using the word encounter, right? So they're going to switch it up. We ain't going to say he discovered the Americas. We're going to say he encountered the Americas. They too are aware of the fact that Christopher Columbus discovered absolutely nothing. He was a man of achievement, tragic and dubious, though the achievement may be. A capsule summary of Mike Ely's article is as follows. So this is from Mike Ely. The U.S. imperialists love Columbus. They have named cities, counties, towns, rivers, colleges, parks, streets, and even their capital after him. And now they are organizing a global celebration. Yet, to the people, the facts are plain. Columbus was a thief, an invader, an organizer of Indian women, a slave trader, a reactionary religious fanatic, and the personal director of a campaign for mass deletion of defenseless people. The bourgeoisie hides these truths as they insist on celebrating him. They say, why can't we celebrate him for his seamanship and his daring? Columbus was utterly lost when he arrived on the beaches of the Bahamas. Until he died, he swore that he had landed in the eastern shore of Asia. which is really on the other half of the world, right? On his second voyage, he had his cruise ship, he had his crew sign papers that declared that if they told anyone of the island of Cuba was not the mainland of China, they would have their tongues cut out. Any reading of his diaries reveals that he was filled not with a lofty courage or adventurous curiosity, but only the most extreme craving to plunder and enslave unarmed people. They say, why can't we judge Columbus by the standards of his time, not ours? This is a revealing argument. We can ask whose standards of 1492 is the measuring rod: the Taino people, the African people, the peasant rebels of Spain, or the conquistadors themselves? Whose viewpoint is we using? The modern imperialists even adopt a sly multicultural covering. Why can't we celebrate all the cultures that come together to make America today? Can't we use this celebration to heal the wounds of the past? And the answer is that this view refuses to distinguish between oppressor and oppressed. The Spanish conquistador and the subjugated Indian are not just two heritages to be celebrated. Why should such wounds be healed? When this celebration glorifies capitalist oppression that continues, when the legacy of that past is stamped on every event and social relationship. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back. Sorry for my video coming out late. As you know, I told you I was traveling this weekend and I didn't have time to get the video together when I wanted to. When I came back, I had to get my mom to the doctor. So I'm getting the video is out now. So I want to make sure I still get you a video on Monday because, you know, we are starting our reading of Dr. John Henrik Clarke's book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism. We finished Black Labor, White Wealth. We finished that book. It was a great read. And I put the poll up and all of you guys, well, the majority of you guys picked this book. So this is our next reading. And I am starting on the introduction on page 15. And that's where we're getting into it, talking with Dr. Clarke, teaching us about the impact of Christopher Columbus, right? Because we talk about, you know, surface level what Columbus did, but have we ever really studied and meditated on the impact, the ripple effect of everything that was set, like Dr. Clarke said, things that were set in motion by Columbus, pulling this stank ass on up here, on up in the Caribbean and destroying those people's worlds. He literally ended their worlds with his presence and the presence of all the other Europeans that were with them. And so because of what Columbus did in 1492, we are here in America at this point, reading this information to put ourselves in a position to liberate ourselves, as Dr. Clarke was talking about in the clip. Movements in the past have happened, but none have actually liberated us. And we always do things that don't necessarily liberate us. So I think we need to concentrate on practical things that could actually bring about real liberation for our people, real freedom. But responsibility does come with freedom, and we talk about it all the time. So if we want to be free, we need to understand the responsibility that comes with it. And freedom means it is now on us to build independently, right? No help from anyone else until you become a powerhouse or until you become respected, right? And so our pride, our dignity, our respect, our families, our culture, our manhood, our womanhood, our religion, our God, our lands, everything was stripped from us because of what happened with Christopher Columbus getting lost. 2 continents of people. Let's really wrap our minds around what happened with the coming of the Europeans, with the coming of Columbus. Because we'll either focus on what happened in America or we'll either focus on what happened in Africa. But looking at it from the whole perspective, 2 continents of people were destroyed because of Columbus arriving in the Caribbean. Didn't even set foot in North or South America. Didn't even set foot in what will become the United States. But all of this exists because of what he did. And 2 continents of people were ravished and destroyed and displaced. So that's what we're getting into. We're going to really break this Columbus thing down. And Dr. Clark is going to be our guide. And so y'all strap up, put your seatbelts on, get your popcorn, do what you need to do, get your snacks, get everything together. Make sure you hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share. I'm a little ashy, but it's all good. Hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share. People need to see this information. People need to hear this information. And if you don't hit that like button, you don't like Dr. Clark and you don't like black people. And Joe Biden told me to tell you that. So let's ride, man. Let's pick up the last paragraph on page 17. Let's get it in. The controversy around Christopher Columbus had his alleged discovery, and what is his encounter with the indigenous Americans set in motion has prompted Pope John Paul III to bring some peace and moderation to the Salvadorians. In a speech in Santo Domingo, he has asked the Indians and the Africans to forgive their captors and their enslavers. The following excerpt is from the Daily Challenger. And so this is the Pope asking for forgiveness. Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, Pope John Paul Tuesday pleaded with all Native Indians of the Americas and African Americans to forgive the white man for 500 years of injustices and offenses. The Pope also said that there was no doubt European colonizers had inflicted enormous suffering on Native Indians because they were not able to see them as children of the same God. In the name of Jesus Christ and as pastor of the church, I ask you to forgive those who have offended you, the Pope said in a message to the hemisphere's indigenous people. Forgive all those who during these 500 years have been the cause of pain and suffering for your ancestor and for yourselves, the Pope said in a many-page message to Indians. His message came one day after thousands of Indians throughout the hemisphere marked the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in America with bitter protest against the European invaders. African American groups have also boycotted commemorations of Columbus, saying his arrival began the destruction of native cultures and led to the African slave trade. The Pope, however, has praised Columbus, saying his discovery led to the introduction of Christianity into the New World. And distinguishing between colonization and evangelization, the Pope has condemned past and present injustices against indigenous people while defending the church's work on their behalf over the centuries. So he don't know what he talking about. He talking about both sides of his neck, right? What the Pope seems to have forgotten, if he cared to think about it at all, is a concept of Christianity created by Europeans for Europeans, and that this Christianity is now a handmaiden of European conquest and expansion throughout the world. Dr. Ben Yakinen has said, religion is the deification of a people's culture. By extension, I have also added religion is the deification of a people's politics and power intent. I wonder, will the Pope ever be willing to ask the Jews to forgive the Germans or the European Holocaust, right? This was a crime committed in Europe by Europeans against European people. Inside the scope, it was small in comparison to the great Holocaust in history. The Holocaust against the African Americans and the indigenous Americans, mistakenly called Indians, was more than 100 times more worse than the European Holocaust that we know so much about. Father Lawrence Lucas, who belongs to the same church as the Pope, has reminded us that before there can be forgiveness, there must first be repentance. Has the Pope called on the criminals who destroyed and enslaved African Americans and indigenous Americans in the millions to repent? Once he calls on them to repent, I believe that some of us will consider forgiving some of them. Until there is some show of repentance on the part of our enemy, we will wear our desire for revenge like a badge of honor. The Pope concludes his message in the following manner. On the last full day of his trip to the Dominican Republic, the Pope met separately with representatives of Indians and African Americans in the Vatican's embassy here and gave them 2 written messages for all their peoples throughout the Americas. In this message to Indians of all tribes, the Pope said the church could not forget the enormous sufferings inflicted on the people of this continent during the era of conquest and colonization. He said the abuses committed by European Christian colonizers were due to the lack of love in those people who were unable to see the indigenous as brothers and sons of the same God, even though they enslaved them in the name of their gods. In a separate message to African Americans, he condemned as a shameful trade the African slavery, which followed the discovery of the New World, and said the Christians responsible have betrayed their faith. And so have you. So have you, Mr. Pope, man. So have you, right? The people again defended the work of early missionaries from the accusations that they were partners in colonization as the cross and the sword marched together. I talk about it all the time. What other motives, if not preaching the ideas of the gospel, spurred the missionaries to denounce the injustices committed against the Indians at the same time of the conquest, he asked, because religion was an important part in their conquest to shape the minds and the spirits. Social engineering is not new. We just got the name for it, but they've been doing it. That's why religion was the handmaiden of that European conquest. He assured them the church was well aware of the alienation that weighs on you, the injustices you suffer, the serious difficulties you have in defending your lands and your rights, the frequent lack of respect for your customs and traditions. He promised them that the church would raise its voice in condemnation whether the human dignity was violated. In his message to African Americans, the Pope denounced the very grave injustice committed against the Black populations of the African continent, who were violently uprooted from their lands, their culture, and their traditions, and taken as slaves to America. He called the slave trade an enormous crime and an ignorable commerce. These men and women were victims of a shameful trade, which was carried out by people who were baptized but did not live according to the principles of their faith, he said. How can one forget the enormous sufferings inflicted on populations deported from the African continent in contempt of the most basic human rights? How can one forget that human lives cut down by slavery? There is a need to confess in all truth and humility this sin of man against man, the Pope said. And yes, the Pope is correct about that, but the Pope is also full of it because the Pope still supports it, even though, because you're sending out hollow apologies that are attached with nothing tangible, because the loss of lives, lands, culture, dignity, pride, all of those things were tangible losses. So are you just offering letters? Because you can keep the letters. We can wipe our butt with those letters. When we go on the toilet, we can use those as toilet paper. Those letters, because those letters don't change or fix history or fix the wounds or repair anything that has happened. Where's the reparation within that, within the hollow apology? You apologizing to feel better about yourself? You can keep that, buddy. And let me see. When was this book published? When was this book published? It was first published in 1993. It was published again in 94 and then in 98. So it was first published in 1993. Yeah. But of course, he wasn't talking about the Pope at that time, talking about the Pope John Paul III, right? I'm just trying to figure out how they think mere verbal apologies is enough. How does that change or fix anything? The way African people and indigenous American people lived was totally disrupted. People were wiped out off the face of the earth. Like, what are we talking about? But that's the mentality of these Europeans, right? It's the sense of, well, if I do this, it'll make me feel good, because in their minds, that's them making their peace with God. But how do you make your peace with God, but not with the people you actually destroyed? Games. These are games they're playing. And we will be a fool to accept the apology. Like I said earlier, those letters that Pope wrote, next time I got the boo-boo, I want to use those letters to wipe my butt. That's how I feel about that. All right, but let's continue. The Pope said he was addressing his message to Indians of all tribes from Alaska to the Tierra del Fuego in the southern tip of South America. The Pope can go to the Tierra del Fuego as well. Like most religious people, the Pope is idealistic but not realistic. I think he would benefit from reading Father de la Casa's book, The Disruption of the Indies and the Tears of the Indians. I would also refer him to Eric Williams's From Columbus to Castro, the documents on West Indian history. And I have that book. I do have that book. After reading these books, he might understand why most of us, both African Americans and indigenous Americans, lack the capacity to forgive or to forget the monumental crimes committed against our people. It is the sort of book that in this sort of book, I am referring to what Christopher Columbus set in motion. In this period, he set in motion an act of criminality that influences our very life today. He laid the basis for Western racism, misconceptions about people, and extensive use of organized religions as a rationale for the enslavement of people. It's a recurring event in the history, and it told us, as nothing has told us before, that history is never old. Everything that ever happened continues to happen. What we are dealing with now is more than the second rise of Europe. We're dealing with the rise of a concept that has taken hold of the mind of most of the world. People throughout the world are now fighting to get away from that concept, and most of the world are now prisoners to that concept because it's been shaped, the mind has been shaped and molded to celebrate and praise the destruction that Columbus has brought to the indigenous people and the African people, but also celebrate the growth that it did for European people. Right? We're dealing with the reason certain things look as though they were going to succeed and did not succeed. We're actually dealing with the reason the African independence explosion did not culminate in independence for independence for Caribbean states. It achieved independence in name only, as he said in the clip, right? Flag independence, that's what he's calling it. If you are free only in name and your flag, you ain't really free because the Europeans still control you. And it was all set in motion by stank ass Christopher Columbus, right? However, in terms of actual economic independence, they are more dependent now than they were at the height of colonialism. It set in motion the exposure of the fact that once you are oppressed and once certain information is kept from you, you begin to experience some confusion about what independence consists of. The African Holocaust that Christopher Columbus helped set in motion is both historical and current, right? We need to carefully examine the initial impact in order to understand its reverberations. That's what I'm saying, right? There's a need to look at the world before Columbus. Let's examine the world of Columbus's day and look at its impact on the Americas. Let's look at the world he did not discover, what he actually did, and he should be credited for this. He set in motion the exploitation of two continents for European domination. He never set foot on North or South America. He set in motion an attitude that is still with us, a concept called divine white right and something called manifest destiny, which white people say, hey, God told us we could take y'all stuff. The assumption was because Europeans had the ships and the basic technology, they had the right to go into other people's country and exploit their mineral resources, take their women and grape them at will. They did all of this in the name of a God that they said was merciful and kind. All of them, including the Arabs, used Western-oriented religions, which made their God ungodly. Now, the role of religions in the domination and destruction of the African civilizations was ruthless. There is no exception. Islam was as guilty as the rest of them. The role of religion in this matter is so shameful that no matter how you look at it, the picture is negative. All of them did more harm than good. And you know what? He made me think about Columbus's actions did set in motion for the African continent the further exploitation from east to west, because East Africa was already being exploited by the Arabs. And so it just made West Africa more vulnerable to Europeans and Arabs and any other groups coming in there, Chinese now and everybody, right? Now let's look at the world from 1400 to 1600 before they come to know what was called the New World, which was not new at all. During the Crusades, the Europeans had exploited each other to the point where Europe was about to explode within itself. The Catholic Church, in its need for funds to build the massive cathedrals and to support parasitic priests, had begun to fleece the people to the point where the faithful began to have some serious questions about the role of the church. The church, in its desire to get still more money from the people, created something called purgatory. Now, when you died, you didn't go directly to heaven, you went to purgatory. Your family and friends had to ransom for your purgatory. The more money you gave to the priest, the harder and quicker he prayed to get grandma and uncle from purgatory into heaven. Scams. Scamming the people. Scam likely. The Pope then was scamming. It was a religious con game played on the people of Europe. They were beginning to discover this game to a point, and out of anger, Europe was about to explode within itself. Then a fortunate incident would happen. An offbeat beatnik hermit named Peter came across Europe, saying that the infidel Arabs were bringing Europeans from visiting were barring Europeans from visiting the holy places, observing the Holy Grail, and visiting the place of the crucifixion. Michael Bradley, in his book Holy Grail Across the Atlantic, had proven that there was no Holy Grail in the first place, and it wasn't lost in the second place. It wasn't where they thought it would be in the third place. The Pope saw a reason he could use to cut down all of this anger against the church. The propaganda swept through Europe, and they could move across Europe in the crusade to rescue the mythological Holy Grail that wasn't lost in the first place. Now, they started to march moving across Europe to rescue, marching across Europe to rescue. However, in the movement across Europe, they forgot the pent-up anger against the church. This gave the church a new lease on life, which would last until the rise of Martin Luther, who would then challenge the church again and lay the basis for Protestant Reformation. There were many crusades and many reasons for people going on crusades, none of which had anything to do with religion or God. The way the story is presented to you in school, you think it has something to do with holiness. It has something to do with European power and Europe rising from the Dark Ages. It has something to do with Europe's search for something outside of Europe to eat, something to do with European emotionalism venting itself on people outside of Europe, and something to do with Europe trying to find a scapegoat for its own anger. Europe was trying to deflect the fact of its own enslavement of other Europeans. They would call it feudalism, but it was an enslavement. It was European enslavement of other Europeans. The Crusaders won all the battles in Cecil B. DeMille's movies. He gave them victories, but in many cases, in real history, they got the hell beat out of them. These well-dressed lords took with them common, ordinary people to do their work with their laundry. These common, ordinary people saw these lords with their tails being beaten on their knees, begging for mercy before the alleged infidel Arabs. They began to understand that these men who owned land and controlled their lives were less than God. In the meantime, back in Europe, some of the young lords had given up a privilege to the old lords, were hanging on to the privilege of first night. If you lived on the Lord's land and you married, he had the privilege of spending the first night with your wife. Some of the young lords had conceded that the poor critter could at least have that privilege. Now, when the old lords came back into Europe, there was a semblance of human recognition for the serf, and the serf is the white slave on the plantation. The semblance of human recognition would lead to more demands. It would lead to a fight against child labor. While it didn't lead to the banishment of prostitution, it would lead to the workhouse and places where they could at least put people out of sight. Europe has lost 1/3 of its population through famine and plagues. On the eve of 1400 AD, this is the sight you see in Europe, far less in creature comforts than anything in Africa and Asia. They were engaged in tribal warfare in Europe as they are engaged in genocidal conflict right now. Only in Europe, you don't call it tribal warfare. You will not deal with the fact that not only what is happening in Russia today is tribal warfare, Russia and Ukraine now, tribal warfare, it is partly race war, right? You forget the millions of Asians who went to Europe and didn't come home. Asian men who came without women and didn't go home to satisfy that biological necessity. Indeed, if it is a necessity all the time, that's another lecture. I think we've overcome that we've overdone that assumption. What is always a biological pleasure is not always a biological necessity. Let's at least concede that much. These Europeans intermingled with these Asians to create a European ethnic entity that is still in Europe. Europe was still hungry and awakening. While it was awakening, it began to pay some attention to the new light in Europe, Spain. Spain was then dominated by Africans, Arabs, and Berbers. This combination of Africans, Arabs, Berbers, and Jewish financial managers known as grandees were totally in control of Spain, parts of France, and Portugal, where the Africans and Arabs had lost power in 1240 AD. However, in 1415, the Portuguese got up enough nerve to attack a small palace at the coast of Northwest Africa, present-day Morocco. The palace was called Ceuta. As battles go, it wasn't much of a battle, and as places go, it wasn't much of a place. I visited the place, and some say it's about the size of Central Park. I've walked all over it, and it's not as big as Central Park, as Dr. Clark is saying. The Battle of Ceuta was a turning point after 711 AD when Jebel Tariq, the African general, or Tariq bin Ziyad, led an army into Spain. Spain had been under the domination of Africans, Berbers, and Arabs. Europe has lived in fear of what they referred to as the infidel Arabs in the Mediterranean. Europe began blocking from the trade the Mediterranean cringed, and it was the Arab that drove the European into the so-called Middle Ages by destroying the European market and the European market in the Mediterranean. The Battle of Ceuta asserted the European, and subsequently they began to claim access to the Mediterranean. By 1455, arguments between the Arab and the African over puritanical approaches to women in Islam had awakened the African Arab hold on Spain in the Mediterranean. When the African joins a religion, he is a Puritan within that religion. Other people join the religion and use it for their best interest. I've always said that people, African people commit to religion. Other people use religions. And we don't understand that difference in the people that we come across. They present as if they commit themselves to religions, but no, they use religions. They use the idea of commitment as a veil of their true intentions. But when the African joins it, he takes it for its purest form. I've said before that we African people will out-pope the Pope, and we will out Muhammad in matters pertaining to both religion and political ideology. Spain and Portugal will now approach the Pope, and the Pope will say to them, "You two good Catholic nations, stop fighting amongst yourselves. You are both authorized to reduce the servitude all infidel people. You should read Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery." A lot of people think it's an old chestnut. This book, written over 40 years ago, is still current and relevant in its information. Brian David, a scholar at Cornell University, wrote a book called Slavery and Western Civilization. That book is 3 times larger and says less. The forgotten character has not been taken into consideration. I'm still on my way to Christopher Columbus, Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry got hold of a cache of maps, which were mostly made by Jewish and gold dealers who had been dealing in the Western Sudan and the coast of West Africa. The Western Sudan is comprised of nations in inner West Africa as opposed to the coastal nations of West Africa. Europe is beginning to see the shape of certain parts of Africa. They are no longer guessing on all of it. Prince Henry Now with these maps begins to open up a school for chart making and chart mapping and let the European know something about the other parts of the world. I recently appraised a book called Prince Henry, the Initiator of the Slave Trade, which is inaccurate. He did set European maritime skills in motion using the maritime information that Africans in the Alps had preserved at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Europe would now go back to sea. It had previously forgotten longitude and latitude. In other words, when they put a ship out to sea, they wouldn't know which way to turn it. They didn't know east from west. That challenge from Mediterranean Africans, the challenge of the Moors, that challenge of the Arabs had driven Europe into the Middle Ages and had dullied the senses of Europe to the fact that they lived now in fear. Prince Henry, while called the navigator, didn't navigate anything. There was no evidence that he ever went to sea. The main thing Prince Henry did was to introduce Europe to maritime information. The European, in turn, used the maritime information coming out of China, then the leading maritime nation of the world, to go out to sea again and to get rid of some of the old wives' tales about the sea. Some of the tales were, if you go so far, the sea drops off, the world was flat, not round. The European had begun to make up his mind. All the hunger, all the famine now. He had ships and guns. The European did not care what shape the world was in, round or flat. He wants it all, round or flat. Sometimes African people approach European power brokers with the assumption that Europeans are going to give us back things they had already taken from us. They took it from you, that you've got to take it back. Let's read that again. If they took it from you, you've got to take it back. There's some indication that a little-known sailor, Cristobal Colon or Christopher Columbus, attended some of Prince Henry's schools in chart making. There he learned the basis of maritime skills. We have no evidence that he had or ever had any command. This gets us into the mystery about Columbus, right? Michael Bradley, in a new book called The Columbus Conspiracy, found out so much dirt under the name Columbus, he maintains there were two Christopher Columbuses. No one man could have been capable of that much dirt, according to Bradley. This includes 7 illegitimate children. When he is faced with the different children that were born and the women, he couldn't move that fast from one to the other. If he sired one over here, he couldn't have gotten to another place fast enough to bring another one into the world. We have to deal with another date neglected in history. In 1482, ships land off the coast of what is now Ghana, earlier the Gold Coast. They insist now on building permanent fortifications. Portuguese ships had been coming along the coast since 1438. They would take a few slaves out of the country, and that happened in 1442. And that talks about it in the book from Columbus to Castro. They talk about this as well, that the Portuguese had already been selling up and down the coast of West Africa before 1492. They would take a few slaves out of the country, right? The Portuguese king, seeing Africans so well dressed and seeing them bringing presents, assumed they were visiting royalty, and in turn gave them presents and sent them home. The idea of enslavement had not reached his mind. The important thing about this trip, when they forced their way into Ghana, and an African king, King Asna, deferred with them and told them, if we saw each other infrequently, maybe we could maintain our friendship. Too much familiarity would erode our friendship. He was beginning to see what could happen. Then, in the beautiful last lines of his speech, he said, the seas is forever pushing against the land, and the land with equal obstinance is forever pushing against the sea. He understood what could happen. But those Portuguese who could not sell him the Bible story forced that gun story on him. They forced their way in and built the Elmina Castle, the first of the great slave forts along the coast of Ghana. If 36 of the 42 slave fortresses are in Ghana, this tells you that Ghana was the headquarters of the slave trade. I mention this because there is some evidence to indicate that Christopher Columbus was part of this expedition. He says in his diary, as a man and boy, I sailed up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years. What was he doing up and down the coast of West Africa for 23 years? He was in the early Portuguese slave trade. This is Christopher Columbus. Now let's go to 1492. In 1492, things happened other than the alleged discovery. That was not a discovery that at all. Let's deal with two African events that helped to set certain things in motion. In 1492, Spain was whitening up through the marriage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. They began now to expel Moors, the Africans, and the Arabs. If they expelled the Jews, and they did, that meant that they did not consider Jews to be white. Most of the Jews were Sephardic. The same descendants of those Sephardic Jews are second-class citizens in Israel right now, though they are the majority of the population. Not a single field officer in the Israel army is a Sephardic, even though they are the majority of the army. That army is dominated by whites, and as the same is true for the Russian army. You've got millions of Asians and Russians. I'm showing you the white face is white. Left or right, no matter what they say, they believe religiously or politically, they play the race game. You have over 30 million Muslims in Russia. Russia has declared itself an atheist nation. Christopher Columbus, in his early voyage, would set a Holocaust for hemispheres in motion. So it's even more than 2 continents, 3, 4, 5 continents, right? Expulsion of the Africans and Arabs from Spain would also set into motion the Inquisition. One of the slickest games in history was the certain standards would tell, certain Spains would tell certain people, especially the grandees, left the money. Those are the money managers of the Spain, of those who are the Sephardic Jews, who are the money managers of Spain. Give me your money or go to the gallows. Many Jews converted to Catholicism. They practiced Catholicism by day and Judaism by night. They were called the Morenos, or the Silent Jews. Some of their descendants still live and are practicing both religions. The best known of their descendants is Fidel Castro. There's a good look on it published in France. There hasn't been an English translation about Fidel Castro and his family, tracing his family back into the Morenos. He will go through the motions of being Catholic, even now playing that wise game. This expulsion would do Spain some harm. This expulsion would do Spain more harm than good, because the grandees who were brought into Spain by the Africans and the Arabs were doing a pretty good job of managing Spain's money. Spain has never had a strong economic system since they expelled the grandees. They killed the goose that laid the golden egg. I say across the board, maybe with the exception of Cuba. Show me a Spanish-speaking country, and I will show you a sloppily, economically run country. Any place in the world, does anybody know a well-run country? They never got themselves together. Another event would happen within the inner West Africa, the Western Sudan. The emperor of the Songhai Empire, Sani Ali, would be killed coming home from a minor war in the south. He drowned when his horse became entangled in underbrush crossing a minor stream. Now the great independent states in Africa are beginning to fall. These states are not coastal states. These are inner West African states. These states could have rescued West African states and saved them from the slave trade. They would go on to the heights of grandeur in the midst of the slave trade and in spite of the slave trade. Christopher Columbus in 1492 set out for a new world. Let's ask some questions. This man had no command position. He has not even been a petty officer. How then did this obscure sailor become admiral of the ocean seas for the Spanish Navy? Who is behind this? Why is it that Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain the same week the Spanish expelled the Jews? Who exactly was Christopher Columbus? Was he sailing out ahead of the expulsion? Dum, 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 dum. Michael Bradley and others have now located those who financed the ships. They were all Jewish bankers who were told, give me your money or give me your life. They were the chief translators on the boat. He was to go to Asia. Why didn't he go to Asia? Sailing up and down the Guinea coast, West Africa, he had discovered from African soldiers who had already gone to the New World, there was a possibility of gold in another direction. I suspect that Columbus turned the ships in another direction. He also discovered that there was a current in the sea. If you pick it up at a certain time of year, it will push you almost straight into the Caribbean islands. That current took him there. This is why ships were lost coming back, because if you come back too soon, the current reverses itself once every 6 months. This is why he ended up in Portugal on his way back. Once he got there, and you should read Eric Williams's Documents of West Indian History. This is the most underrated Caribbean scholar. The most people underrate him because he didn't like the way they ran Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know how he ran Trinidad. I know he was a damn good researcher and one of the finest of the Caribbean researchers. I knew him at Howard as a professor of political science. He was a brilliant man and he had a big ego. He was a very brilliant scholar, ego notwithstanding. Documents of West Indian History was not only one of the 4 volumes he had compiled. He goes through Christopher Columbus's diary, the best analysis of Christopher Columbus's diary I've ever seen. When Columbus saw these indigenous Africans, mistakenly called Indians, he said in his monologue, "I wonder why they are bringing such small amounts of gold. I wonder where the mines are. They'll be easier to conquer than I thought they would be." He would write a letter to Queen Isabella saying, "From this area I can send you as many slaves as you can accommodate." He never thought of partnership. In his mind, it was enslavement from the very beginning. His intentions were not good. He would kill off his own labor supply. He would kill some of the people who could have helped him find the gold. For the documentation on this, I wish someone would read Father Bartolomeo de la Casa's work, The Devastation of the Indies. I have that book, The Devastation of the Indies. I do have that book. It's a small book and you read it in one evening or less. I do have that book as well. Father de la Casa is called the first historian of the New World. He wrote it all down. Christopher Columbus would go to him after the 3rd voyage and the rapid disappearance of the Indians. He would go and ask for an increase in the African slave trade, allegedly to save the soul of the Indians. When the Pope would send commissions to various islands sometimes, not one Indian would be alive, but the African endured. If the African endured and the Indian perished, it had nothing to do with the fact that one was braver than the other. It had to do with the structure of their societies. The Indians had a monolithic society and the African came out of a pluralistic society. Many societies functioned side by side. The Indian came out of a monolithic society, which was tightly woven. When they existed side by side with other societies, they did not give the other societies the same integration or recognition. Sometimes they waged relentless wars against the neighboring society. However, now the Aborigine is rapidly disappearing. Father de la Casa said that from 12 to 25 million people were killed. We're just talking about the Caribbean islands alone. We're not talking about South America, although he alludes to Mexico and South America, but his main concentration is on the Caribbean islands. Christopher Columbus would go from one place to the other. He thought Cuba was Japan. He was sent to the East Indies and would end up in the West Indies. He told his sailors to sign a document that they were in the East Indies, and if they did say anything, they would get their tongues cut out. Ivan van Sertima has done an informative and concise chapter on this in this book that came before Columbus. When we look at this man and what he was setting, and what he has set in motion, he set in motion the increase in the African slave trade. The British had not entered the slave trade at first because the British had some difficulty with the Catholic Church. However, once the British decided to establish a church of their own, and if you're of British extraction and belong to the Church of England, you have to live with the fact that here's a church whose foundation was the hot sexual passions of Henry VIII. If anybody wants to prove otherwise, I'll hear them. Henry VIII wanted to cut off one of his wives' head and wanted to marry another. He wanted all the wives. He wanted justification. He wanted a church that would back him up in all of his skullduggery, including his thievery, his raid on the church treasury. So he created the kind of church that would give him what he wanted, the Church of England. Throughout his career, he defended the church as so sacred. It was sacred to him because it let him do what he wanted to do. He referred to the church as though it was synonymous with his state. The queen whose head he cut off was the only one to give him a child that survived. That child was Elizabeth I. Someone called her the alleged Virgin Queen of England. He won't discuss that any further. Excuse me, we won't discuss that any further. They showed her a ledger of what could be made in the slave trade after she had refused to go into business, and finally she went into the business. One of the ships was her personal property, the good ship Jesus, commanded by Captain John Hawkins. Britain came into the slave trade and made it a business, a dirty business, but a business. They are well-organized gangsters with territory. The British sailed up the Gambia River and took 10 miles on each side. That's a little facsimile nation that is called the Gambia right now. It was never a visible nation in the true sense. They would spread their slaveholding hunger. They would spread their slaveholding further west. They would push the Portuguese out of the West African slave trade. What about the world Christopher Columbus set in motion? He set in motion Western racism. He set in motion the colonization not only of history, but the information about history. All of the fight over curricula was set in motion because Christopher Columbus and others set in motion a concept of divine right and manifest destiny. The assumption that the people of Europe had rights over other people set in motion another bogus concept of a chosen people by God. If God chooses one people over another, then God is a bigot. You cannot say this is also a God of love, God is kind, God is not a respecter of kith and kin, and say, God choose me to do something. Then while the people are choosing in so much as you chosen people choose themselves, why in the hell don't you choose yourself to be free? Why wouldn't you make a choice and say, we are too proud to live in slums? Why don't you understand what went wrong with the world Christopher Columbus did not discover? Why can't we understand how other people rose from the bottom and rediscovered what belongs to them? And that is our reading of the day. That's from from pages 15 to pages 32, the introduction. But the last part, Dr. Clark talks about it a lot. If other nations who were destroyed were able to rise from the ashes, what is wrong with Black Americans? Why aren't we able to rise from the ashes? And so that's something we got to work on, being able to pick ourselves up and change our destinies, change our future. Understanding what set in motion us being here today. You know, I hear a lot of people talking about why should we study history? Why should we focus on history? Why should we always concentrate on history? It's not a mass concentration or a mass focus, but it's an understanding of, okay, this happened. Let's learn from this so we could push forward and be able to create a new future for ourselves. But we got to understand how we got here. So for the next video, we're getting into chapter 1, the nature of the gathering storm. And that is from pages. So if you haven't gotten your copy of the book, get your copy of the book. Okay, so next, we might end up reading 2 chapters next video. Chapter 1 and we're going to end up reading chapter 1 and chapter 2. So that'll be from pages 33 to pages 46. From 33 to 46, chapter 1 is the nature of the gathering storm. And chapter 2 is Africa before the slave trade. So big thank you to Dr. John Henry Clarke for his body of work and his passion and his persistence. Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, slavery and the rise of European capitalism. So make sure y'all get y'all copy of the book, read the book. Let's get down on it. Let's learn. Let's apply. Let's just not read. Let's apply. Let's make sure that we are doing things tangibly to recreate something tangible for a real future. This is On the Shoulders of Giants, courtesy of Dr. John Henry Clarke. Thank you to everybody who continues to support this channel. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Big shout out to Patrick Irvin, Professor Carl Tone Jones. Big shout out to the brother Raw. Big shout out to my man Rodney, heavy. Big shout out to Rodney Heavy. Big shout out to Dr. Tia Johnson. Shout out to everybody who's doing amazing things on their YouTube channels. Home Team History. If y'all haven't checked out Home Team History, check him out. You know, the Black Authority, Dennis Sperling, some of everybody who's out there doing big things, doing great things, and giving great information. Tariq, all those people giving great information to Black people, that we can make sure that we are not fighting each other, but we're doing what we got to do to heal and move forward and grow and empower and become respected people. So love you all. Make sure y'all catch the next video coming up. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. And if you don't hit that like button, you don't like Black people. See y'all next time, next Monday. Peace out. Well, see y'all tomorrow. See y'all tomorrow. Peace out.